Okay, as we said earlier, we're moving straight to section D. We'll come back to part C after the break. This is about off-site provision of housing required by the mixed-use policy. So perhaps Margaret, if you wanted to introduce this first part there.
The core strategy mixed-use policy says where it's appropriate and practical, an equivalent amount of residential floor space will be provided on-site when increases in commercial floor space are applied for. This is increases over 200 square metres in the case of offices or 400 in the case of other commercial uses. So this is an attempt to set out a cascade of options when it isn't considered appropriate or practical to provide that residential on site. And so it goes through a series of options, and these are just proposals for your consideration. So the first one is the residential accommodation will be provided on another commercial site in the vicinity. And then it goes on to discuss when and how we would apply off-site provision beyond the vicinity, and then where on-site or off-site provision of residential isn't feasible, a financial contribution to the Affordable Housing Fund would be required, and possibly in instances where there's a large amount of residential floor space that would normally have been required, we could also ask for another type of mixed use, for example, a social and community use or cultural use or affordable small business units. And basically we're just asking what positive aspects are there, what negative, have you got any other alternatives that you think we should apply to this cascade of options when we agree that on-site residential isn't possible?
Hello, Mark Flessing from Pocket. We had a recent meeting on this already with Margaret and her colleagues, so I'll keep it short. It seems to me at the very heart of this, we need to come up with a system which is transparent, which is fair, and that is easy to manage and monitor. And our proposal was that you operate on a floor space basis. Once you've established what the on-site affordable housing floor space area would be, you then provide an escalator on that, dependent on whether, with officers' support, you provide the off-site provision inside the CAS or outside the CAS. And we were particularly of the view that where this has significant merit is in the provision of intermediate housing off-site, because it struck us that where land values are at their lowest, often are in areas with high concentrations of social rented accommodation, where the benefit of tenure diversification through intermediate housing infills might actually be quite attractive, so that maybe the focus in terms of the land credit could be to provide the escalator, particularly on intermediate housing that's provided outside of the CAS. In terms of social housing, we could quite see why there would be strong arguments for keeping that within the CAS. And it seems to us that if you came up with a map of Westminster on that basis, so that there is clarity for the developer as to where that intermediate housing would be welcomed, then that might provide with a very effective way forward to manage things, as I said, transparently, fairly.
Can I just clarify what I wasn't quite sure about the relationship between the within CAS and the without CAS. Are you suggesting that for a commercial development within CAS that they provide their housing requirement outside of CAS in an area that's already high in social rented accommodation, has low land values?
The point I'm making is that in order to get the benefit of off-site provision, it clearly is useful to find areas of low land value so that you can get an awful lot more quantum for your buck, as it were, in terms of affordable housing. But that from a big mixed and balanced communities point of view, it may well be that the area to focus on is intermediate housing, because the areas of low land value in Westminster will tend to be areas with high social rented accommodation, where you actually should want to encourage, and indeed many of your members do, wish to encourage the provision of intermediate housing. So if you said off-site provision, that's fine, but we want to have it all within the CAS, my argument back to you would be, actually there seem to be very good policy reasons to encourage for the intermediate housing to go outside of the CAS and give you a quantum increase in intermediate housing, and the social housing could stay within the CAS.
Right, so you're saying that would be the second tier on the cascade. The first would be the principle of the on-site provision. The second would be off-site in those areas that you've talked about with lower land values at the moment and outside of CAS, and that there'd be a multiplier and that it would be predominantly provided as intermediate housing. Is that right?
That is where I think you can get the quantum increase in affordable housing, yes.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, it strikes me that the Roman 3, that on the cascade, would result in the kind of things that Mr. Vessing is just talking about generally there. So it might be logical to have a new point 3 put in there, which would replicate point 2, but just replacing the words outside the central activity zone. So in other words, we'd be looking for first in the vicinity, second within CAS, core CAS, but more, third outside core CAS, but even more, and then fourth, paragraph 3, basically, the contribution.
Okay, that would be great. You.
Many of you will know this is a hobby horse of mine, so I'll try and keep it short. I think if one goes back to the fundamentals to what is this policy about, I think it's three things. The first is you do want to incentivise and improve all forms of buildings in the city. That's offices and residential. You want as much good residential as possible, and you want as much good commercial accommodation as possible, and you don't want to undermine the character of an area. So all I would say to you is that we know from our work over the last 18 years, we have a schedule of all the use swaps we've done for one certain owner, and I can tell you as a fact that the residential output by using swaps is infinitely greater than it would have been on an on-site building-by-building basis, and those are the statistics. And you end up with much more attractive residential buildings and much more effective and efficient commercial buildings. And I think in that area, no one would think that the character of that area has been undermined as a mixed-use location as a whole over that period of, as I say, 16 to 18 years. So I think if you look at the evidence, some of the anxieties about these ideas are not borne out